November 22nd, 1963, Moscow, Soviet Union, 9:30 p.m. Moscow time. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev is at home at his dacha outside Moscow. The telephone rings. It's the duty officer from the Kremlin calling with urgent news from the United States. The officer tells Khrushchev, President Kennedy has been shot in Dallas, Texas. American radio reports say he is dead. Khrushchev is stunned. According to witnesses present that evening, Khrushchev's first response was disbelief. Khrushchev asked, "Are you certain? This cannot be true." The officer confirmed American media was reporting Kennedy's death. The reports appeared credible. Khrushchev hung up the phone. Khrushchev turned to those present and said, according to his son Sergei, who was there, "What? That is terrible. This is bad. This is very bad news." Within hours, Khrushchev would make a public statement expressing the Soviet Union's shock and grief. Within days, Khrushchev would go to the American embassy in Moscow personally, an unprecedented gesture, to express condolences. Khrushchev's actions and words in the days after Kennedy's assassination revealed the complex relationship between the two leaders and Khrushchev's genuine concern about what Kennedy's death meant for U.S.-Soviet relations. This is the story of what Nikita Khrushchev said when he learned about Kennedy's assassination, why Khrushchev's reaction was so strong, and how Kennedy's death changed Soviet-American relations during the most dangerous period of the Cold War. Let's start by understanding the relationship between Khrushchev and Kennedy and where that relationship stood in November 1963. August 1961, the Berlin Wall went up, dividing the city. Kennedy protested but took no action to stop it. Khrushchev interpreted this as weakness. October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet missiles in Cuba brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. For 13 days in October 1962, Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade of Cuba. Kennedy demanded removal of Soviet missiles. Khrushchev initially refused, threatening war. Then, on October 26, 27, 1962, both leaders stepped back from the brink. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles. Kennedy secretly agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. Both leaders chose peace over war. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev were deeply shaken by how close they had come to nuclear war. Both realized that direct communication was essential to prevent miscalculation. Both recognized that despite ideological differences, they shared a responsibility to avoid destroying the world. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev began to develop a working relationship based on mutual respect and shared fear of nuclear war. In June 1963, Kennedy delivered his famous American University speech, calling for peaceful coexistence and an end to the Cold War's most dangerous aspects. Kennedy said, "If we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity." Khrushchev was impressed. Khrushchev ordered the speech published in full in Soviet newspapers, an unprecedented gesture. Khrushchev told aides that Kennedy's speech showed genuine desire for peace. July 1963, the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed in Moscow. The treaty banned nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. This was the first major arms control agreement between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev considered it a major achievement. August to November 1963. Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged letters discussing further steps toward détente. The letters showed increasing warmth and mutual understanding. Kennedy addressed Khrushchev as Mr. Chairman, but the tone was respectful, even friendly. Khrushchev reciprocated. By November 1963, Kennedy and Khrushchev had established a relationship unique in the Cold War. They were ideological enemies representing opposing systems, but they had looked into the nuclear abyss together and decided to step back. They had begun building trust. This was the context when Khrushchev learned that Kennedy had been assassinated. Early on the morning of November 23rd, Moscow time, Khrushchev prepared a public statement. The statement was broadcast on Soviet radio and television. The Soviet government and the Soviet people share the deep grief of the American people over the tragic death of President John F. Kennedy. The name of John F. Kennedy will go down in history as linked with the struggle for peace and for better relations between states. The heinous murder of the young President of the United States is a heavy blow to all people who hold dear the cause of peace and Soviet-American cooperation. This statement is remarkable for several reasons. First, it's unambiguously sympathetic. Soviet propaganda typically portrayed American presidents as imperialist warmongers, but Khrushchev calls Kennedy's death a heavy blow and praises Kennedy's commitment to peace. Second, it emphasizes Kennedy's role in improving Soviet-American relations. Khrushchev is signaling that the progress made since the Cuban Missile Crisis was valuable and should continue. Third, it calls the assassination heinous murder, strong moral language unusual in Soviet diplomatic statements.
But Khrushchev wasn't satisfied with just a public statement. Khrushchev decided to take an unprecedented step, going to the American embassy in Moscow personally to sign the condolence book. This decision shocked Soviet officials. Soviet leaders never visited foreign embassies. Embassies came to them. For Khrushchev to go to the American embassy was a major gesture, breaking protocol and showing extraordinary respect. On November 23rd, Khrushchev traveled to the American embassy in Moscow. He was accompanied by Foreign Minister Gromyko and other senior officials. U.S. Ambassador Foy Kohler met them. Khrushchev signed the condolence book. Then Khrushchev spoke to Ambassador Kohler. According to Kohler's cable to Washington, Khrushchev said, "President Kennedy was a man who understood the responsibility he bore for the preservation of peace. We had our differences, but on the main question, avoiding nuclear war, we were in agreement. I valued our correspondence. I believed we were making progress toward a more peaceful world. This is a great tragedy. I hope that the improvement in Soviet-American relations will continue." Khrushchev became emotional during this statement. Kohler reported that Khrushchev's eyes were moist. Khrushchev's voice broke slightly when speaking of Kennedy's death. Khrushchev then asked Kohler to convey his personal condolences to Mrs. Kennedy and the Kennedy family. Khrushchev said, "Please tell Mrs. Kennedy that the Soviet people share her grief." After leaving the embassy, Khrushchev returned to the Kremlin. Khrushchev continued to monitor the situation in the United States closely. Khrushchev was concerned about who would lead America now and whether the progress toward détente would continue. Khrushchev sent a personal letter to the new president, Lyndon Johnson. The letter, dated November 23rd, expressed condolences and hope for continued cooperation.
Dear Mr. President, the tragic death of President Kennedy has deeply grieved the Soviet government and the Soviet people. Allow me to express sincere sympathy to you personally, to the Kennedy family, and to the entire American people. In the person of President John F. Kennedy, the Soviet people saw a statesman who realized the great responsibility for the preservation of peace throughout the world. We hope that the principles which guided President Kennedy in the solution of international problems will continue to guide American policy. Johnson responded politely but non-committally. The Johnson-Khrushchev relationship never developed the warmth of the Kennedy-Khrushchev relationship. Over the following days, Soviet media gave extensive coverage to Kennedy's funeral. Soviet television broadcast footage of the funeral procession, the burial at Arlington, and the grieving Kennedy family. This was unprecedented. Soviet media rarely showed American events in such detail or sympathetic light. Khrushchev sent a Soviet delegation to Kennedy's funeral, led by First Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan. Mikoyan attended the funeral on November 25th and met with President Johnson and other American officials. In private conversations with Soviet officials, Khrushchev expressed his concerns about Kennedy's death. According to minutes of Presidium meetings later released, Khrushchev said, "Kennedy's death is bad for us. We had just established a channel of communication. We were beginning to understand each other. Kennedy understood that nuclear war must be avoided. Now we must start over with Johnson. We don't know Johnson. We don't know if Johnson understands the dangers as Kennedy did." Khrushchev also expressed suspicion about the assassination. In a private conversation recorded by his son, Khrushchev said, "I don't believe this was just one madman with a rifle. There are too many people in America who hated Kennedy for making peace with us. The military-industrial complex, the Cuba exiles, the reactionaries, they wanted Kennedy gone. Maybe they got their wish." This statement reflects Khrushchev's worldview. Khrushchev believed in conspiracy, in shadowy forces manipulating events. Khrushchev couldn't accept that a lone assassin killed Kennedy. Khrushchev assumed darker forces were involved. But Khrushchev was careful not to make these suspicions public. Khrushchev didn't want to inflame tensions or give American hardliners excuse to blame the Soviet Union. In the months after Kennedy's assassination, Soviet-American relations cooled. The personal connection between Kennedy and Khrushchev was gone. Johnson was focused on Vietnam and domestic issues. The momentum toward détente slowed.
In October 1964, less than a year after Kennedy's death, Khrushchev himself was removed from power by his Politburo colleagues. Khrushchev's colleagues criticized his impulsive decision-making and foreign policy failures. Khrushchev was forced to retire. Leonid Brezhnev became Soviet leader. Khrushchev lived in forced retirement until his death in 1971. During those years, Khrushchev worked on his memoirs. In the memoirs, published after his death, Khrushchev wrote extensively about Kennedy. "I was genuinely sorry when Kennedy died. Even though he was a representative of the capitalist class, I had come to respect him.
He showed during the Cuban crisis that he had the courage to stand up to his own military and choose peace over war. That took real bravery. Not many leaders have that courage. I had hoped that Kennedy and I could continue the progress we had started. We had pulled back from the brink of war. We had signed the test ban treaty. We were talking about further steps. Then Kennedy was killed, and that opportunity was lost. I don't know who killed Kennedy or why. I know the official story is that it was one man acting alone, but I have my doubts. Kennedy had many enemies in the military, in the intelligence services, among the anti-Castro Cubans, among those who profit from the arms race. Any of them could have wanted him dead. What I do know is that Kennedy's death was a tragedy not just for America, but for the world. We lost a partner for peace. We lost someone who understood that in the nuclear age, we must find ways to live together, or we will die together. These reflections show Khrushchev's genuine regard for Kennedy and genuine regret at Kennedy's death. Whether Khrushchev's conspiracy suspicions were justified remains debated, but Khrushchev's emotional response to Kennedy's assassination was real.